The east wing of the Harrington estate was a sterile, temperature-controlled tomb. It smelled of bleached linens and expensive, ineffective air fresheners. Inside, 2 5-year-old boys lived in the shadow of a tragedy that had claimed their mother and left them trapped in bodies that wouldn't obey. For Miles Harrington, the billionaire who had built his life on the power to fix anything, the sight of his own sons was a silent, daily reminder of his most devastating failure. He stayed away, drowning his guilt in high-stakes mergers and cold, calculated silence, until the day a desperate single mother walked through his doors and started breaking the furniture. Miles Harrington did not like messes. He built his fortune in global logistics by eliminating them. If a supply chain in Southeast Asia fractured, he excised the weak link. If a shipping route in the Atlantic proved inefficient, he rerouted the fleet. Everything in his life operated on metrics, predictability, and control. Everything except the east wing of his Chicago estate. Behind 2 heavy oak doors lay a fully functional, state-of-the-art pediatric ward. It smelled of isopropyl alcohol, bleached linens, and expensive lavender diffusers that completely failed to mask the scent of medical necessity. This was where his 5-year-old twin sons, Hayes and Jude, lived. They did not walk. They did not speak. A catastrophic lack of oxygen during a traumatic delivery had taken their mother's life and left the boys with severe cerebral palsy. They were locked inside their own bodies, tethered to custom-molded wheelchairs that cost more than luxury sedans. Their days were a rigid schedule of passive range-of-motion exercises, measured caloric intake via feeding tubes, and quiet, agonizing hours staring at a television screen. Miles paid a small fortune for a rotating staff of registered nurses. The nurses wore pastel scrubs. They spoke in soft, pitying tones. They treated Hayes and Jude like antique glass on the verge of shattering. And Miles stayed away. He told himself it was because he was busy. The board demanded his attention. The acquisitions couldn't wait. But the truth was grittier, heavier, and buried deep in his chest. Looking at his sons felt like staring into the sun. It blinded him with grief. He couldn't fix them. For a man who fixed the world, his impotence in that sterile East Wing was a daily crushing humiliation. Then came Tuesday. The head nurse quit. She left a politely worded email citing emotional burnout. Miles didn't read past the first line. He forwarded it to HR and demanded a replacement by nightfall. Instead of a seasoned pediatric nurse from a premium agency, he got Nora Jenkins. Nora did not belong in the Harrington estate. She sat in his vast glass-walled home office, wearing a thrift store blazer that was fraying at the cuffs. Beside her, kicking her legs against the mahogany chair, was a 6-year-old girl named Lily. Nora was a single mother. Her resume was a jagged timeline of physical therapy clinics, early intervention programs, and sudden gaps in employment. Miles glanced at the paper, then at the woman. She didn't look intimidated by the billionaire across the desk. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles beneath her hazel eyes, and her posture was stiff, held together by sheer, desperate willpower. "You're not an RN," Miles said, his voice flat. He tossed the resume onto the desk. "I'm a licensed physical therapist and a special education behavioral specialist," Nora replied. Her voice wasn't soft. It had a raspy, no-nonsense edge. "I lost my clinic 2 years ago when my ex-husband emptied the business accounts and left the state. I've been working home health ever since." Miles looked at the little girl, Lily, who was currently staring at a multi-million-dollar modern art sculpture as if it were a strange jungle gym. And the child? "Lily goes where I go," Nora said, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. "I need a live-in position. The agency said you needed someone today. I'm here. I'm qualified. And I don't quit when things get difficult." Miles stared at her. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was survival. He knew men on Wall Street who didn't have half the predatory grit this woman was radiating right now. She didn't pity him. She didn't offer condolences about his sons. She needed a roof. He needed a warm body to monitor the East Wing so he could get back to a merger. "They don't talk," Miles said, leaning forward, the cold corporate CEO slipping seamlessly into place. "They don't walk. They are completely dependent. Your job is to keep them clean, comfortable, and safe. Do you understand?" "I understand," Nora said. "Good. HR will set you up in the guest quarters. Keep your daughter out of the West Wing." Miles stood, signaling the end of the meeting. He didn't think about Nora Jenkins again for 3 weeks. He assumed she would blend into the quiet, tragic machinery of his home. He assumed she would put on pastel scrubs, speak in whispers, and feed the boys their pureed meals on time. He assumed wrong. The first sign of trouble came from his housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. She cornered Miles in the kitchen one morning as he poured his black coffee. "Mr. Harrington, you need to speak with the new woman," Mrs. Gable said, her mouth a tight line of disapproval. "She's disruptive." "Is she hurting the boys?" Miles asked, not looking up from his tablet. "No, sir. But she's not treating them like patients. Yesterday I found her and her daughter in the medical wing. The television was off. The classical music was off. They were listening to Bruce Springsteen. Loudly." Miles paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "Springsteen?" "Yes. And she had the boys out of their chairs. On the floor, Mr. Harrington, just lying there on a foam mat while that little girl, Lily, read comic books to them. It's entirely unprofessional." Miles felt a spike of irritation. The chairs were designed to support their spines. The floor was unacceptable. He set his mug down. "I'll handle it." But he didn't. A crisis in the Hamburg shipping port swallowed his week. He slept at the corporate office for 3 days. When he finally returned to the estate, it was a dreary Tuesday afternoon. Rain lashed against the towering windows of the mansion. The house was eerily quiet. Miles dropped his briefcase by the door, loosened his tie, and headed toward the kitchen. As he passed the corridor leading to the East Wing, he stopped. There was no sound of the ventilator, no quiet hum of the humidifiers. He walked down the hall, his leather shoes silent on the Persian runners. He pushed open the double oak doors to the boys' room. It was empty. The expensive wheelchairs sat vacant. The beds were made. A sudden icy panic seized Miles's chest. For a terrifying second, the worst-case scenario flashed through his mind. Ambulances, hospitals. Then he heard it, a sharp ringing sound echoing from the back of the house. A child's laugh. Miles turned and walked briskly toward the sound. It led him to the conservatory, a sprawling, glass-enclosed room where his late wife had once cultivated rare orchids. Miles hadn't stepped foot in it for 5 years. He kept the gardeners paid to maintain it, but it was a mausoleum of greenery. He reached the glass doors and stopped dead. The pristine, temperature-controlled conservatory had been desecrated. Miles stared through the glass, his jaw tight. Nora had dragged two massive, shallow plastic storage bins into the center of the imported Italian tile floor. She hadn't just brought the bins, she had filled them with wet black potting soil. Mud. Nora was sitting cross-legged between the two bins, wearing old sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, her hair tied up in a messy knot. And in the bins, stripped down to their diapers, were his sons. Hayes and Jude were lying on their stomachs, propped up slightly by rolled towels under their chests. They were covered in dirt. Black streaks of mud painted their pale, atrophied arms and legs. Miles felt a surge of pure, unfiltered rage. He grabbed the brass handle and shoved the door open. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice cracked like a whip through the humid air. Nora didn't flinch. She looked up, wiped a streak of dirt off her forehead with the back of her wrist, and held up a hand to silence him. It was a commanding, sharp gesture. No one told Miles Harrington to wait. "Give us 10 seconds, Nora said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. She didn't look back at Miles. Her eyes were locked on Jude. Miles stepped forward, ready to fire her on the spot, ready to pull his fragile sons out of the filth. But the scene before him froze the anger in his throat. Nora had placed a bright red, wriggling earthworm just a few inches from Jude's right hand. Jude's face was locked in a grimace of absolute concentration. His body, usually rigid and locked in involuntary spasms, was trembling. "Come on, Jude," Nora murmured. It wasn't the pitying, baby-talk voice the other nurses used. It was the voice of a coach down by 1 point in the final quarter. Gritty, demanding. "You see it, you want it, take it, move the arm." Miles watched, breathless. Jude's breathing was shallow and erratic. The boy's right arm, thin and usually pinned to his side by spasticity, began to jerk. It wasn't a random spasm. Miles had watched his son spasm for 5 years. This was different. This was intentional. Jude's eyes were laser-focused on the worm. The boy's shoulder hitched. The muscles in his neck stood out in sharp relief. "He's trying," Miles realized, a cold shock washing over his skin. "He is trying to reach for it." "Don't look at me. Look at the target," Nora said firmly as Jude's eyes darted up in frustration. "You've got it. 2 more inches." Beside them, Lily was sitting near Hayes's bin. She wasn't treating him like a sick patient. She was holding a plastic dinosaur. "If Jude gets the worm, my T-Rex is gonna eat it," the little girl announced matter-of-factly, tapping the toy against the edge of Hayes's bin. Hayes couldn't move his arms well enough to reach, but Miles saw something that made his heart stutter. Hayes was watching his brother. And then, slowly, deliberately, Hayes rolled his head to the side, looked at Lily, and blinked his eyes twice in rapid succession. "T-Rex is waiting," Lily said casually, interpreting the blinks without missing a beat. Miles stood paralyzed. He watched Jude's arm scrape awkwardly through the mud. His son's knuckles dragged against the wet soil. Dirt caked beneath the boy's fingernails. It was messy. It was unhygienic. It was exactly the kind of chaotic, bacterial nightmare the doctors had warned against. And then, Jude's trembling fingers brushed the squirming worm. Jude let out a sound. It wasn't the low, mechanical wheeze of a passive breath. It was a sharp, guttural sound of triumph. A grunt. A victory cry. Jude's face broke into a massive, lopsided smile. His eyes, usually dull from the sedatives and the television, were bright, wide, and entirely alive. Nora let out a breath and grinned. She reached over and tapped Jude's muddy shoulder. "Hell yes, buddy, good job. T-Rex doesn't get dinner tonight." She finally turned to look at Miles. He was standing by the door, his $1,000 suit feeling like a straitjacket, staring at the dirt, the worms, and his smiling son. "They were bored, Mr. Harrington," Nora said simply, breaking the heavy silence. "Their brains work. Their eyes track. They understand exactly what's going on around them, but everyone treats them like they're deaf and cognitively empty just because their motor cortex is damaged." Miles took a slow, deliberate step into the room. He looked at the mud on his sons. He looked at their flushed, strained faces. "The doctors said they needed a sterile environment," Miles managed to say, his voice lacking its usual authority. "The doctors are managing their decline," Nora countered, wiping her hands on a towel. "I'm trying to manage their life. They are 5-year-old boys. 5-year-old boys like dirt. They like loud music. They like knowing that if they fight hard enough, they can touch a worm." She stood up, facing him. She was inches shorter, covered in potting soil, and yet she looked like the one in charge. "I spent the last 2 weeks mapping their eye movements. Hayes blinks twice for yes, a long close for no. Jude has marginal control over his right shoulder and bicep, if you give him a tactile reason to use it. Foam blocks aren't a reason. Mud is." Miles looked down at Jude. The boy was still smiling, his hand resting in the dirt near the worm. Jude looked up at his father. For the first time in 5 years, Miles didn't see a tragic medical file. He didn't see a broken link in a chain. He saw a little boy who had just won a fight. "You didn't ask for permission to take them off their monitors," Miles said. It was a weak defense, a habitual retreat to the rules. "If I asked, you would have said no," Nora replied bluntly. "You pay me to keep them safe. But safe isn't enough. Not for them." Miles looked at Nora, really looked at her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the fierce, protective glare in her eyes. She was a woman who knew what it meant to fight for inches, to scrap for survival. She wasn't intimidated by his money because money couldn't make a paralyzed boy reach for a worm. Grit did. Patience did. Lily walked over, completely ignoring the tension between the adults, and tugged on Miles' suit trousers with a muddy hand. She left a distinct black handprint on the imported wool. "Hayes wants you to see his mud mountain," Lily said, pointing at the other bin. Miles looked at the handprint. A week ago, he would have fired the staff and burned the suit. Now, he looked from the stain to Nora, and then to his sons. Slowly, Miles Harrington took off his tailored suit jacket. He dropped it on a nearby teakwood chair. He unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up his sleeves, exposing his forearms. Nora watched him, her eyes narrowing in slight confusion. Miles walked past her, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the spilled dirt. He knelt down beside the second plastic bin, completely ruining the knees of his trousers. He looked at his son, Hayes, who was staring back at him with wide, intelligent eyes. "All right," Miles said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in half a decade. "Show me the mountain." The mud was a declaration of war on the quiet tragedy of the Harrington estate. Within 48 hours, the sterile East Wing ceased to exist. Miles stood in the hallway with a mug of black coffee and watched as moving men hauled the 2 custom, multi-$1,000 medical beds out the front door. Nora directed the chaos with the ruthless efficiency of a foreman. She replaced the clinical beds with expansive, firm floor mattresses. She stripped the heavy blackout curtains and let the harsh, honest Chicago sunlight flood the room. The soothing lavender diffusers went into the trash. The room now smelled of actual life. Warm milk, laundry detergent, and the occasional sharp tang of rubbing alcohol when necessary. rather than by default. Miles didn't go back to the corporate office. He told his board he was working remotely. His CFO called him, panicked about a supply chain collapse in Munich. Miles muted the call and watched Nora wrestle a weighted vest onto Hayes. "He hates it," Nora grunted, pulling a Velcro strap tight across the boy's chest. Hayes was visibly furious, his jaw locked, his eyes darting frantically. "Then why are we doing it?" Miles asked. He was leaning against the doorframe, his tie loose. "Because his core muscles are melting," Nora shot back, not looking up. She sat back on her heels and looked Hayes dead in the eye. "You're mad, I know. It's heavy. But you're going to sit up for 2 minutes, Hayes. 2 minutes of work, and then Lily will read you the rest of the comic." Hayes blinked a long, slow close. "No." "Negotiation denied," Nora said flatly. She placed her hands on his shoulders and physically helped him into a sitting position. "Engage the core. Hold your head." Miles stepped into the room. A week ago, he would have called this abuse. He would have fired her. Now he saw the sweat breaking out on his son's forehead. He saw the sheer, unadulterated effort in Hayes' eyes. He wasn't a fragile antique. He was a kid in the gym, fighting gravity. "Can I help?" Miles asked. Nora looked over her shoulder. She wiped a stray hair from her face. "Get behind him. If he tips backward, catch him. But don't support him unless he's actually falling. Let him do the work." Miles dropped to the floor. The expensive wool of his trousers snagged on a rogue plastic block. But he didn't care. He positioned himself behind Hayes. He felt the heat radiating off his son's small back. Hayes was shaking. The weighted vest was doing its job, forcing the boy's atrophied core to engage just to stay upright. 10 seconds, Nora counted down, her voice a rhythmic bark. 9, 8. Look at me, Hayes. Don't drop the chin. Hayes' head wavered. He was losing the battle. Miles' hands hovered an inch from his son's back, every instinct screaming to catch him, to make it easy. "Don't touch him, Miles," Nora warned, her eyes locked on Hayes. It was the first time she had used his first name. It slipped out, raw and unguarded. Hayes let out a strained, high-pitched grunt. He fought the sway. He pulled his head back up. 3, 2, 1. Time. Nora reached out and caught Hayes as he collapsed forward, breathing hard. She laid him gently on the mat. "Good fight, buddy. Really good fight." Miles sat on the floor, staring at his hands. He was trembling. The adrenaline in his veins rivaled any boardroom buyout he had ever orchestrated. He looked at Nora. She was already moving on, checking Jude's feeding tube site with clinical detachment. The days bled into weeks, forming a new, grueling rhythm. Miles stopped returning evening emails. He spent his nights sitting on the floor, holding foam blocks, tracking eye movements, and reading reports on neuroplasticity. The divide between the billionaire CEO and the single-mother physical therapist dissolved in the crucible of sweat, vomit, and minor victories. They didn't talk about their pasts. They didn't share wine over candlelit dinners. Their intimacy was forged in the trenches of caregiving. It was the shared look of exhausted triumph when Jude managed to push a plastic ball 3 inches across the floor. It was the silent, synchronized panic when a feeding tube clogged at 2 in the morning. Lily became the chaotic glue of the household. She treated the boys not as patients, but as accomplices. She snuck them tastes of pureed chocolate cake. She painted Jude's fingernails neon green while he slept. She sat between them on the floor mattresses and watched cartoons, demanding that they blink to choose the show. She gave them agency, and Miles found himself watching Nora. He watched the way the harsh morning light caught the exhausted lines around her eyes. He watched the relentless, grinding determination that fueled her. She didn't offer him pity. She demanded his participation. She forced him to be a father. Winter hit Chicago with brutal force. Ice coated the towering windows of the estate. Inside, the house was warm, loud, and alive. It was a Tuesday evening. Miles was on his laptop, finalizing a restructuring of his European division. He was sitting on the floor of the boys' room. Nora was beside him, stretching Jude's hamstrings. The mundane normalcy of the scene was shattered by a sudden, violent choking sound. Miles dropped his laptop. Hayes's body was locked in a rigid, terrifying arch. His eyes were rolled back. A thick, wet rattle tore from his throat. A seizure. It wasn't entirely unexpected with his condition, but the severity was new. The boy's lips were turning a faint, terrifying shade of blue. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through Miles. He froze, the billionaire paralyzed by the fragility of human biology. "Miles, get the oxygen!" Nora yelled. She didn't freeze. She moved with terrifying speed. She rolled Hayes onto his side, clearing his airway, her hands steady as her voice cracked like a whip. "Now, Miles, move!" The command snapped him out of it. He scrambled across the floor, tearing the portable oxygen tank from its wall mount. He fumbled with the mask, his hand shaking violently. Nora snatched it from him, slapping it over Hayes's nose and mouth, cranking the valve. "Come on, buddy, breathe. I need a breath," she ordered, her face inches from his. Miles knelt beside her, helpless. He watched Nora's hands, the same hands that had dug in the mud, the same hands that forced his sons to fight. They were holding his son to the earth. 80 seconds passed. It felt like a decade. Finally, Hayes's body went limp. He took a deep, shuddering gasp of oxygen. The blue faded from his lips, replaced by a pale, exhausted pink. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and terrified. Nora let out a long, ragged exhale and slumped back against the wall, running a hand through her hair. She looked at Miles. Her chest was heaving. Miles didn't say anything. He crawled forward and pulled Hayes into his arms. He didn't care about the tangled tubes. He just buried his face in his son's neck, feeling the steady, miraculous thump of his pulse. He looked up at Nora. "Thank you," Miles whispered. It was a completely inadequate word. It was a drop of water in an ocean of gratitude. Nora gave a tight, exhausted nod. "He's okay. He's going to be okay." The seizure changed the calculus. It reminded Miles of the stakes. The next morning, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to his board of directors, announcing an indefinite leave of absence. The second was to a tech firm in Silicon Valley that specialized in experimental assistive communication devices. 3 weeks later, a technician installed a monitor at the foot of Hayes's mattress. It was an eye-tracking system, calibrated to the micro-movements of his pupils. It cost a small fortune, but Miles would have burned his entire empire to the ground to buy it. Nora spent days calibrating it with Hayes. The system was simple. Stare at a word or a picture on the screen for 3 seconds, and the computer would speak it. It was a frustrating, exhausting process. Hayes's spasticity made it hard for him to hold his gaze. Nora was relentless. "You want the TV on?" Nora asked, pointing to the screen. "Tell me, look at the box." Hayes strained. His eyes darted around the screen, unable to lock on. Frustration radiated from him. He let out a sharp cry of anger. "Take a break," Miles said softly, standing in the doorway. "He's tired, Nora." "He's mad," Nora corrected. "There's a difference." "Try again, Hayes." Lily wandered into the room, holding a half-eaten apple. She stepped right in front of the expensive monitor blocking the screen. "Lily, move," Nora warned. "Hayes owes me," Lily said, taking a loud bite of the apple. "I let him pick the cartoon yesterday. It's my turn to pick." Hayes' eyes snapped to Lily. If looks could kill, the 6-year-old would be Ash. He shifted his gaze back to the monitor. He locked his eyes on a specific grid box. 1 second. His head twitched. He fought it. He held his gaze. 2 seconds. Miles held his breath. Nora leaned forward. 3 seconds. A mechanized, flat, robotic voice echoed from the computer speakers. "No." Silence fell over the room. Miles stopped breathing. He stared at the screen. He stared at his son. Lily grinned, completely unfazed by the monumental breakthrough. "Yes, my turn. We're watching Batman." Hayes' eyes darted back to the screen. He locked on again. 1, 2, 3. Mad. It was just 2 words. A mechanized refusal and a statement of emotion. But to Miles Harrington, it was a symphony. It was a roar. It was proof of life. Nora let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes. Miles walked over and sat down beside Nora. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at his son. Hayes was looking back at him, a distinct smug satisfaction in his eyes. "He said no," Miles whispered, his voice cracking. "He's stubborn." Nora wiped her eyes, a fierce smile breaking across her face. "Just like his dad." Miles turned his head. Nora was close. The distance between them had eroded, washed away by mud, seizures, and sweat. He reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Her fingers were calloused, strong, and warm. She squeezed his hand, anchoring him to the reality of the room. They weren't fixed. Hayes and Jude would never walk normally. They would always need help. The road ahead was decades of physical therapy, medical scares, and fighting against a world that preferred things to be easy. But the sterile silence was broken. The fortress had fallen. Miles squeezed Nora's hand, looking at the chaotic, messy, beautiful life she had dragged him into. He had built an empire by eliminating messes. But as Jude grunted in his sleep, and Hayes angrily tracked the computer screen to argue with Lily about Batman, Miles realized the truth. He didn't want control anymore. He just wanted them. This story proves that real miracles aren't sterile or perfect. They are messy, loud, and fought for every single day. True strength isn't about ignoring the pain. It's about getting down in the mud and fighting alongside the people you love. If this story of resilience, unconditional love, and a father finally finding his heart touched yours, please hit the like button. Share this video to inspire others, and don't forget to subscribe for more deeply human, grounded storytelling.